The spring Nora Hayes turned 12, she began riding her bicycle 3 miles north to the Miller sheep farm with 2 empty feed sacks tied across the rear rack. The road ran between broad potato fields and low pastures where the last snowmelt collected in shallow ditches. Each afternoon, Nora returned with the sacks swollen and uneven, filled with grey wool that smelled of lanolin, dust, rain, and sheep. It was not the clean white fleece people imagined when they thought of wool. This was the material cut from muddy legs and bellies during shearing. It contained burrs, dry grass, short fibres, and dark stains that no spinning mill wanted. The better fleece was rolled, weighed, and sold. The worst of it was piled behind the shearing barn, where it waited to be burned or buried. Nora asked Mr. Miller whether she could take it. "You can take all of it," he said. "Just do not bring it back." If you enjoy quiet stories about ordinary people who notice what everyone else overlooks, subscribe and join us. Sometimes the most useful ideas begin with something another person has thrown away. At home, Nora dragged the first sack into the potato field and opened it between 2 rows of young plants. She pulled the wool apart by hand and spread it over the soil in wide grey strips. Around each potato stem, she left a small circle of bare earth. Then she pressed the outer edges down with damp clods so the afternoon wind would not carry everything away. By sunset, the first row looked as though a flock of sheep had vanished and left its coats behind. Her older brother, Jacob, stood at the field edge with his arms folded. "Are the potatoes cold?" he asked. Nora ignored him and opened the second sack. Her father, William Hayes, was less amused. He walked along the row, lifted a handful of wool, and inspected the soil beneath it. "You are putting this on the field because..." "To keep the ground from drying so fast." William looked across the farm toward the irrigation ditch. The soil in Bingham County was productive, but wind and summer heat could pull moisture from its surface within hours. "You may try 6 rows, he said. "No more until we know what it does." That permission was enough. For the next 2 weeks, Nora collected every bag of unwanted wool the Miller family would give her. She worked before breakfast and after school, spreading it between the potato plants while neighbors passed on the road. Some slowed their trucks to watch. Others asked William whether his daughter planned to grow potatoes or knit sweaters. The jokes were harmless, but constant. Nora did not tell anyone that she had already begun testing the soil beneath the wool. She did not explain that her covered rows remained cool after the uncovered ground had warmed in the sun. She simply carried another sack into the field. Everyone else saw dirty wool. Nora saw a roof for the soil. The Hayes family had grown potatoes on that land for 3 generations. Nora's grandfather Arthur remembered teams of horses pulling simple diggers through the fields. William remembered the first irrigation pipes his father could afford. Nora had grown up among seed cutters, sorting tables, storage sheds, and long rows of plants that seemed to stretch until they met the mountains. She understood that potatoes did not grow from the green leaves everyone could see. The real crop developed underground, where moisture and temperature mattered as much as sunlight. That was why Nora paid attention to the soil. After irrigation, the open rows turned dark and heavy. By afternoon, the surface became pale again. Wind moved fine dust through the plants, and a crust formed over the top layer. When Nora pushed her finger into the ground, she often found that the cool moisture had retreated farther down. The idea of using wool began beside the family's doghouse. William had stuffed a few handfuls of rough fleece between its wooden walls before winter. One spring morning, Nora placed her wet gloves on a loose piece that had fallen beside the building. She forgot about them until evening. The wool felt dry on the outside, but when she pulled it apart, the fibers inside remained cool and damp. The soil beneath it was darker than the exposed ground nearby. Nora decided to test what she had noticed. She filled 2 shallow wooden boxes with soil taken from the potato field. She poured the same amount of water into each one. The first box remained uncovered. Over the second, she placed a thin layer of discarded wool. Every morning and afternoon, she checked them with an old kitchen thermometer and a narrow wooden stick marked with pencil lines. The uncovered box warmed quickly. Its surface dried and hardened. The covered box stayed cooler. The soil beneath the fleece remained dark for longer, and the wooden stick came out with damp earth clinging to it even after the first box had become dusty. Grandfather Arthur found Nora crouched beside the boxes one evening. "That is mulch," he said. Nora looked up. "Even if it is wool. Mulch does not care what name people give it." Arthur explained that farmers and gardeners had long covered soil with straw, leaves, bark, or cut grass. The covering reduced direct sunlight, slowed evaporation, softened the impact of rain, and protected the surface from wind. Wool behaved differently from straw, but it could perform some of the same work. Its tangled fibers trapped air. They could hold water between them and release it gradually. Over time, the natural material would break down. Nora did not need the clean fleece that brought money to sheep farmers. She needed the waste. The burrs did not matter. The stains did not matter. The short fibers that could not become yarn did not matter. A spinner judged wool by whether it could become cloth. Nora judged it by what happened to the soil beneath it. She began recording the temperature of her 6 covered rows and 6 ordinary rows at the same time each day. At first, the differences were small. Then the days grew warmer. By late morning, the bare soil could already feel hot against her palm. Under the wool, the ground still felt like morning. Nora's first method was wrong. She had assumed that if a little wool protected the soil, a thicker layer would protect it better. On 2 of the experimental rows, she spread the fleece nearly as deep as her hand. Then a spring storm crossed the valley. Rain soaked the wool until it became heavy and matted. Several young potato shoots bent beneath the wet fibers. One plant disappeared completely under a grey clump that had shifted downhill. The following afternoon brought strong wind. Dry pieces lifted from the edges of the rows and rolled across the field like strange pale weeds. Some caught on fence wire. Others collected in the irrigation ditch, where Jacob had to pull them out with a rake. The smell became another problem. Wet sheep wool carried an odor that seemed to settle over the farmyard. Jacob announced that the potatoes now smelled like a barn. At lunch, he asked whether the family would have to wash the harvest before they could enter the house. Even William began losing patience. "We cannot spend every windy day chasing this across the county," he said. Nora stood at the end of the field, looking at the loose wool hanging from the fence. She knew he was right. The idea might work in a wooden box protected from weather. A field was different. Wind, rain, machinery, and growing plants turned a simple experiment into a practical problem. Nora removed the thickest material first. She pulled the wet mats away from the stems and separated them into thinner layers. Around every plant, she left enough open space for new shoots to rise without resistance. Instead of spreading long loose fibers, she formed smaller flat sections and pressed them close to the soil. At the raw edges, she mixed the wool with a light covering of straw. The straw caught the fibers and made them harder for the wind to lift. In the most exposed places, she added small clods of moist earth as anchors. The next storm moved less material. A few pieces still escaped, but most remained in place. Nora also discovered that not every kind of fleece behaved the same way. Long, tangled wool formed stable mats. Very short, dry fibers blew away easily. Greasy wool resisted wetting at first, while weathered wool absorbed water more quickly. She began sorting the bags before carrying them to the field. The neighbors continued joking about the smell and the grey rows. One of them called Nora's experiment the sheep potato patch. The name spread quickly, but Nora now had measurements. After irrigation, she checked the soil at equal depths. The ordinary rows dried first. Their surfaces formed a pale crust that cracked under pressure. Under the wool, the ground remained softer. The covered rows did not stay wet forever. They still needed water. But the moisture lasted longer, especially beneath the thinner layers that allowed air to move without exposing the soil directly to the sun. Even William began checking the experimental rows when he thought Nora was not watching. One afternoon, she saw him kneel, push his fingers beneath the wool, and compare the soil with the row beside it. He said nothing, but he stopped asking when she planned to remove it. The field still looked strange. The difference was that it had begun to look strange for a reason. The heat arrived in late June. At first, it seemed like an ordinary stretch of clear weather. The mornings were cool, the afternoons bright, and the potato plants continued growing. Then the temperature rose again and did not fall. By the first week of July, The wind felt dry even before noon. Water in the irrigation system arrived on a stricter schedule. Farmers who had once allowed a little extra time at the end of a cycle now watched every gate and ditch. Fields farther from the main channel waited longer between waterings. The potato plants responded quickly. During the hottest hours, leaves folded and stems lost their firmness. Most recovered after sunset, but each day demanded more from them. The exposed soil hardened. Fine cracks appeared between the rows. Nora measured the surface temperature with the same old thermometer she had used in her wooden boxes. On the uncovered ground, the metal warmed so quickly that she could not leave it lying in the sun for long. Beneath the wool, the reading was lower. The difference did not make the soil cold. It simply kept it from becoming as hot as the open surface. William remained cautious. "Cool soil is useful," he said, "but potatoes cannot drink temperature." Nora agreed. The wool did not create water. It could only slow the loss of what the farm already had. They tested the moisture together after the next irrigation. William chose 2 plants of similar size, one in an ordinary row and one in Nora's covered section. With a narrow shovel, he opened the soil beside each plant at the same depth. The uncovered row was damp below, but the upper layer had already dried and loosened. Under the wool, the dark moisture reached closer to the surface. The soil held together when William pressed it between his fingers. The next watering produced the same result. Then the heat intensified. Day after day, the sky remained pale and empty. Dust collected on the lower leaves. Farmers along the road began irrigating at night to reduce evaporation. Some potato fields showed uneven growth where the lightest soil lost moisture first. The Hayes farm suffered too. Several ordinary rows weakened near the southern boundary. Plants wilted earlier each afternoon and recovered more slowly. William adjusted the water, but there was only so much available. Nora's 6 rows were not untouched. Their leaves drooped under the midday sun, and a few plants remained smaller than the others. But by evening, most stood upright again. The wool reduced the speed at which the surface dried after each irrigation. The strange grey covering helped every watering last a little longer. That small advantage repeated itself through the hottest weeks. One afternoon, the neighbor who had invented the name Sheep Potato Patch stopped his truck beside the fence. He did not make a joke this time. He looked from the open rows to Nora's covered ones. "Is that ground still wet under there?" he asked. Nora lifted a corner of the wool. The soil beneath it was dark. The neighbor crouched and touched it. For the first time all summer, nobody laughed. The heat finally weakened near the end of August. Cooler nights returned first. Then clouds appeared over the mountains, though they brought little rain. By then, the potato plants had already passed through the most important part of their growth. Harvest would show whether Nora's experiment had protected more than the surface. William marked the covered rows so their potatoes could be collected and weighed separately. He did the same with 6 nearby rows that had received the same variety, planting date, and irrigation schedule without the wool. The first machine pass exposed the difference in the soil. The ordinary rows had hardened in places. Dry clods broke around the potatoes as the digger lifted them. In Nora's section, the soil was looser and easier to separate. The wool itself had changed. It no longer resembled the thick grey fleece Nora had carried from the sheep farm in spring. Some fibers had darkened and begun mixing with the ground. Fine roots and small insects moved beneath the mats. Where the covering had remained thin and stable, the soil smelled cool and earthy. The potatoes were not enormous. Nora had not expected them to be. There were small tubers, damaged tubers, and weak plants in both sections. The heat wave had affected the entire farm, and no layer of wool could erase weeks of high temperatures. But when William weighed the harvest, Nora's rows produced more marketable potatoes and fewer of the smaller sizes. The difference was not enough to transform the farm's finances. It was enough to prove that the waste fleece had helped the plants use limited water more effectively. William wrote the results in his farm notebook. Then he drove to the Miller sheep farm. Mr. Miller assumed William had come to complain about the smell or return the unused material. Instead, William asked how much waste wool would be available after the next shearing. Word spread. The neighbor who had laughed loudest visited after harvest. He lifted a partially decomposed piece of fleece and found dark soil beneath it. A worm disappeared into the ground beside his thumb. "How thick did she put it?" he asked. Nora showed him. She explained why the wool could not cover the stems, why thin layers worked better than heavy mats, and why the edges needed straw or soil in windy places. She also explained the limitations. Applying wool by hand required time. Large fields would need different equipment. Loose fibers could clog irrigation channels. Thick wet fleece could press down young plants. The method would not suit every crop or every farm. But for gardens, small plots, and selected rows, the material had value. The following spring, Mr. Miller burned less waste fleece. 2 neighboring families collected bags for their vegetable gardens. William allowed Nora to expand her test, though he still refused to cover the entire farm until they had more than one season of results. Nora did not make the summer cooler. She did not produce more water. She simply kept the sun and wind from taking it quite so quickly. The wool had been too dirty for clothing and too tangled for spinning. People had judged it by the work it could no longer perform. Nora judged it by the work it could still do. Sometimes what saves a harvest does not arrive in a new machine or an expensive container. Sometimes it lies in a pile behind a barn, smelling of rain and sheep, waiting for someone to see that waste is only a name people give to usefulness they have not discovered yet.